Good afternoon and good morning, I guess, if you're on the West Coast. It is Signing Day, National Signing Day 2016, our favorite day in which high school prospects, recruits, blue chippers, 4 stars, 3 stars, 2 stars, not rateds alike will be signing and begin signing with their future home. I'm joined by Bud Elliott, and we are moments away from the #1 recruit in the nation, Rashan Gary, selecting either, we presume, Michigan or Clemson. Will he be doing it live in studio
not
here?
With us,
no,
maybe with the
not with us. No, but good times ahead for either one of those schools. But first, let's start out. Who right now, in this very moment, is winning signing day?
I think you have to start with 3 schools.
Okay.
Florida State,
Yep.
Alabama, and Texas. All 3 have made just great closes here, signing multiple 4- and 5-star prospects down the stretch at positions of need. Texas, getting some guys on offense, really reloading that defense. They had some playing time to offer. Florida State reloading the offensive line.
Yeah.
Alabama reloading the defensive backfield.
And always an interesting depth of 14 players that are 5-star kids for Alabama in that defensive backfield, with Nick Saban's specialty being there.
They've been #1 overall for the last 5 years. I mean, that's a half decade of dominance, and it shows with 4 titles over the last 7. Looks like they're probably going to be #1 again if they close well this afternoon.
9 of the 11 top schools of the 24/7 composite, as we speak right now, are in the South. If you consider Texas the South, because they've had a very, very strong day.
Well, they're not SEC, but their neighbors are SEC now.
Their neighbors are SEC now. So, of course, Michigan and Ohio State, the 2 schools not from the South that are finishing quite strongly. Michigan having a huge signing day spectacular in the market for the #1 player in the country. So we expect Jim Harbaugh to be very pleased with his recruiting class. Ohio State could be the #1 team in the nation, or they're right there after yet another successful season, in Columbus. Were you surprised by any schools that are perhaps top 15 at the moment?
I don't know that we're surprised because I follow this throughout the year. We are seeing some schools like a Baylor and a Michigan State. I don't know exactly where they're ranked as of this moment, but
right.
You see, they got about a half decade now of good product on the field and winning, and we're finally seeing that start to show up in the recruiting rankings. It used to be that Michigan State and Baylor were used to kind of turn 3 stars into superstars because they fit their system. They developed them well, et cetera, et cetera. Now you're actually seeing them celebrate signing some more 4- and 5-star type players, getting some of the best players in state, and that's really important especially for a Michigan State type program with Jim Harbaugh now coming in. You're lucky you won those games like you did recently. Competing
against also Urban Meyer, a Wisconsin team that has had a lot of recent success, Penn State, who has recruited very well of note. So yes, it's certainly very impressive of Michigan State and Baylor loading up on players, Michigan State on the defensive side of the ball and Baylor with offensive speed that very much fit their system.
Indeed.
All right, and with that, I don't mean to cut you off. We are now joined by Roll Bama Rolls, Brent Taylor, who I'm assuming it's a Scrooge McDuck diving into a golden pool type of day for Alabama as they haul in a number of huge prospects over the course of the recruiting cycle and today. So, Brent, welcome, and what is your thought in general of this 2016 Tide class?
Hey, it's been like Christmas this morning, kind of getting to see all this going on. Starting out with Shyam Carter in the morning, one of the top-rated cornerbacks, extremely athletic. And all of a sudden, that just started a wave. You had Maiden commit not long after, and then Robinson flipped from Florida after that. So in the course of 2 days, when you include Nigel Knott, Alabama went from no cornerbacks to 4 in just a really short time.
Not too shabby.
Nice pun.
Yeah. After that, you ended up getting Ben Davis, the top linebacker in the nation, which... he's been a Bama lean. Everybody kind of expected him to, but seeing him finally put his name down on paper was great.
All right, and obviously Alabama is deep at a number of positions, but even though schools will use the depth against the Tide, they certainly get freshmen into the mix, into rotation. So when you look at positional depth across the board for the current Tide, which players do you see making a relatively early impact for the Tide?
I'd say the most likely are going to be the defensive linemen after Ashawn Robinson and Jaron Reed left for the NFL, along with DJ Petway. That's probably the spot where there's the most open rotation to get in. Guys like Kendall Jones, Raekwon Davis, and even the JUCO commit, King, would all be – they've all got a great shot of getting in early, particularly, Jones with his massive size, and Davis too.
Excellent. Brent Taylor, thank you very much for joining us on signing day and I suppose recruiting Christmas if you're a Tide fan. And Bud, let's take a look, if we can, at Ben Davis, a superstar inside linebacker for Alabama. We're going to pull it up here in a second. What makes him a special player?
Well, first, he's the son of Alabama's all-time leading tackler. So if you didn't think he was going to Alabama, let's pay a little more attention throughout the year.
Yeah.
6'4", great football IQ, extremely athletic. I mean, he's probably 240-something, but yet he can still play 3 downs of football. I saw him make an incredible one-handed interception this summer at a 7-on-7 where he was right in front of the quarterback, leapt up, and just kind of snatched the ball like it was a rebound.
If you look at his lateral ability.
Right, look at the pursuit here as he flows.
Such an impressive huddle. I mean, just
it really is.
Play after play, he's that good.
A great player and a deserving number 1 linebacker in the country. A lot of times you don't necessarily see linebackers become 5-stars, but because he has the ability to blitz, to play the pass, both in man and zone, and he's great length to take on blockers coming out at him. He can stone those guards, shed, make the tackle, and do it.
Bit of a hiccup there, but yes, Alabama's class is outstanding. We're going to move on to LSU here in a moment and talking to Dan Davis from And the Valley Shook. But what makes LSU's class so special? Where did they focus and which names jump out to you?
They did a great job on the defensive line and in the secondary. In the defensive line, they got several 4-star defensive tackles. We just saw right now, breaking news on the Expedition Signing Day. Kristen Fulton, who I think everybody thought was going to go to LSU. He is the number 1 player in Louisiana. He's the number 1 cornerback, or one of the number 1s in the Southeast. Won't actually turn 18 until the end of next season, so there's a lot of growth potential there. Some of these best players we see are more in like the 19, 20-year-old range, like a Calvin Ridley. Kristen Fulton, a lot of growth potential, being only 17 right now. Great defensive line, great job at the receivers. They got the quarterback in Lindsey Scott, who maybe wasn't their top target initially because they lost Franks to Florida. Good job to come back there and get a guy that can add depth to that. And they kept Drake Davis at receiver.
Yes, and this is a class loaded with defensive players. You know, they lose a little bit to the NFL this season, but LSU really loading up on the defensive side of the ball at all 3 levels. All right, we are now joined by Dan Davis, who is a terrific writer and editor for And the Valley Shook. So, Dan, when you look at this LSU class, which is very clearly top 3, 4, 5 at the moment, who jumps out to you?
I mean, you got to lead with Christian Fulton and Rashan Lawrence, 5-star defensive tackle. I think those are the top 2 players in the class. But, yeah, you're right. I mean, up and down, this is just such a strong class throughout and meets a lot of needs that you could name any number of guys and be right.
Who do you expect to get on the field quickly for the Tigers?
Number 1 guy is Michael Divinity, big-time 4- or 5-star linebacker from in-state. They got him as an early enrollee. Linebacker depth is really, really poor at LSU right now, so I think he has a great shot to start maybe as soon as the Wisconsin game, right off the bat.
All right, and depth-wise, how do you think they did addressing needs? It's one thing to go after a number of positions, but was Les Miles and his staff, were they successful in addressing what the Tigers needed to do to fill up the depth chart?
For the most part, yeah. I think the 2, if there's misses, you might ask questions about Lindsey Scott at quarterback. He was a late offer. Does he fit the system? Is he a guy that can lead the offense the way that Cam Cameron wants to run it? But really, at least they have a body there. But the big miss was Eric Fowler this morning flipping to Texas.
Yep.
Leaving LSU, again, down a linebacker where it's just a spot where they need bodies. They need good players because there's not a lot on campus. Kendall Beckwith returning helps, but you only have him for 1 more year. So they need to further build up that depth chart, and that's a big loss.
Fair enough. Dan Davis, thank you very much for joining us, and good luck the rest of the way figuring out how LSU is going to move around so many blue chip pieces down there in Baton Rouge.
Good problems to have, Dan. They're so loaded with talent. Like you mentioned, Rashan Lawrence, who gave us the great "Can I eat still?" part of when we were asking these kids what they would do for a video interview this summer. Divinity is a nice player to have because he is college-ready size. I mean, he's probably 230-something at this point. I don't have exact weight in front of me, but a really good player who can come in, play early, split some snaps. Beckwith leaves. He could become a full-time starter in 2017. It's LSU. They can get some young kids the year after this to come in and supplement that linebacker depth. You'd like to have more. Eric Fowler, a great player, did flip to Texas. But,
sure.
I mean, this class is certainly going to finish top 5 today.
And Louisiana per capita, the most talented state recruiting-wise.
I believe so, yeah. Especially now. If you look at the numbers, we're about, a decade out after Katrina now?
Yes.
So you're starting to see the numbers rebound really in that state. It's more talented this year than Ohio is. And I don't think we've had that phenomenon for probably,
it's been a while,
5-6
yeah.
years. Yeah,
absolutely. So LSU in good shape, and I guess Les Miles, hot seat to just great time on the recruiting trail.
It's kind of a nice little get some to the people that wanted to fire Les Miles.
John Chavis leaves last year, but they just don't miss a beat at all, especially loading up on defense. The LSU defensive reputation is so sterling still.
And they hired Dave Aranda from LSU, which I think is a great hire. I mean, did nice things at Wisconsin, a lot of talent. He's got to be jacked, man, to be able to go down there and play with that kind of talent. That's exciting.
It is quite the armory. And as we move on to Florida, a year for the Gators with quarterback drama both on the field and on the recruiting trail. They bring in Georgia commit Jacob Eason for a visit with the Georgia coaching change. They flip an LSU commit in Felipe Franks later on in the process. What do you think of Florida's class at this point, both during the entire recruiting tenure and what they did today?
I think it's a good class because they address a lot of needs. They do have a lot of depth in this class. Now, today they missed on some targets down the stretch. I mean, Kristen Fulton chose LSU. John Simpson chose Clemson. Shavar Manuel flipped to Florida State. They did, importantly, get Tyree Cleveland out of Houston. Who's a really good receiver. They beat out Arkansas. They beat out TCU. He's originally from Jacksonville. And they also have Antonius Clayton, who I think a lot of people have compared to a Dante Fowler because he has that great speed around the edge.
All right, and they lose Will Greer, obviously suspended and decides to transfer. Felipe Franks, how do you evaluate him? Is he a college-ready quarterback, or is he more of the skills are there, but down the line is when he'll really affect the team?
To steal a phrase from the guys who evaluate baseball, he's toolsy. Right?
Okay.
Big-time arm, more athletic than you think. He's a bright kid, and he did enroll early, which I think is going to help. Will he be ready to play in the SEC? I'm not convinced of that. I think that Jack Del Rio's son will actually, Luke Del Rio, who transferred in from Oregon State after being at Alabama, he may have a true shot at that job. If they have to play Franks, he's kind of be trial by fire, but eventually I think he could be very good because of a lot of talent.
All right, and with that, we bring in Andy Hutchins from Alligator Army. Andy, welcome, and how do you evaluate the job that Jim McElwain, in his first full season recruiting, how do you evaluate the job he did in putting together this class?
Thanks for having me. And I think it's a two-part thing. You've got to look at, I think, both the early enrollees, where Florida, I think, hit something close to a home run with, you were just talking about Felipe Franks and several other players, Josh Hammond, Freddie Swain, a couple of JUCO guys, and Mark Thompson and Dre Massey, who I think are all really going to help Florida's offense and might help it even as early as this fall. The early enrollees, I think, if you look at those as a group, and there's 12 of them, so it's a nice big group of them for Florida, that is a very good group of players. Now, if you go back to National Signing Day and to what Florida's been able to do with fall enrollees, I don't think it's quite as good. Obviously, Tyree Cleveland, getting him in the boat is a big deal.
Oh, yeah.
He's quite possibly Florida's best wide receiver recruit since Percy Harvin, so that's a big deal. He's a kind of guy who you could pair with Antonio Callaway, the bigger guy, that could give Florida sort of a physical presence that they've been lacking close to the goal line. But, some of these other players are not necessarily people that you would think an SEC East champion would be able to land. Florida obviously losing Shavar Manuel today, who's slipping to FSU.
Right.
Missing out on the offensive lineman that they wanted. So there are things to like and then there are things to not like.
All right, and Florida obviously loses a couple of big offensive skill players to the NFL, as well as some really talented players up front, and Vernon Hargraves. That can't be overstated. How do you look at the job that Jim McElwain did in terms of replacing depth, addressing needs, not just for this year, but moving forward the next couple of years?
I think the depth is probably the strength of this class. The early enrollees that I spoke of, those guys are going to be immediate depth. I think some of the fall enrollees might be later on depth. Antonius Clayton, he could be an instant impact guy, but he's one of a very few instant impact guys on defense. Where Florida's probably going to be pretty good in 2016, but then you've got to sort of reload and get guys in Jeff Collins' system rather than the sort of continuation of Will Muschamp's system that Florida had in 2015. And I think you got a lot of players who could do that. Jaywan Taylor, Quincy Lenton, Chauncey Gardner, all going to be good secondary players, but might be better secondary players in 2017 or 2018 than they are immediately. I think McElwain did a really good job last year in sort of stocking up Florida's offensive line, and some of those players who weren't necessarily playing last year. Martez Ivey, a 5-star, did play a lot, but he was really the only freshman who made a huge impact. Fred Johnson did some stuff too, but those guys who didn't play last year are going to sort of be the players who end up being in roles this year. And I think the offensive linemen this year will probably redshirt. And if you can get to a spot with your recruiting of offensive linemen where you're redshirting your incoming freshmen
and playing redshirt freshmen and sophomores and so on, you've done a good job of building that. McElwain's biggest task, I think, coming into last year was definitely building that depth on the offensive line, where confluence of factors really made Will Muschamp's last couple of lines very thin. Good lines in some ways, but very thin, and definitely made that a disaster area that McElwain needed to clean up.
All right, Andy Hutchins, thank you very much. Everybody, of course, Florida-wise, do check out Alligator Army. They do an outstanding job on signing day and on the recruiting trail all season long. Moving along, Ole Miss, a team that the past few years has succeeded on a huge level and are now seeing that initial class that really got them attention, got the Rebels' attention. Laquan Treadwell, Laramie Tunsil, among others. They're moving on to the NFL. How good of a job have they done this season of addressing needs and really keeping the talent level that high?
I think they've done very well. Look, Ole Miss, people look at them and they say it was that 2013 class. Was that a flash in the pan? Can they sustain? Well, folks, guess what? They got a lot of really good recruiters on this staff. Young guys who connect with people. I think Ole Miss does a really good job of identifying the influencer, and by that I mean, look, who is going to help make this kid's decision? Is it the high school coach? Is it the mom? Is it the brother? Figuring out all those factors are very important. They get Greg Little. They get Shea Patterson, who I think is the most polished quarterback in the country. I don't think he's the most talented. If you like tools, you probably go with Easton at Georgia, who we'll talk about in a little while.
Right.
If you like polish, you probably like Patterson. I think that he'll sit this year behind Chad Kelly and come in and immediately be an impact player in the SEC as a redshirt freshman or as a true sophomore. Greg Little is a guy who's not going to be able to sit.
No.
Because Ole Miss does not have very good offensive line depth, and they lost their left tackle, Laramie Tunsil, to the NFL, as well as their right tackle. So he's going to be starting at one of those tackle positions almost assuredly when they open up on Labor Day against Florida State in Orlando. Greg Little has the talent to be an impact player in the SEC, the number one tackle in the country. Really great feet, nice balance, good technique. His film is actually kind of boring, you said yesterday in Washington, because he dominates the competition just so routinely. How do you pick a highlight when pretty much all these are pretty good?
Yeah, it's like he just has blocking sleds in front of him, and you're like, well, yes, he is most certainly better. Ole Miss's class is particularly interesting, coming off of a strong finish to the season with their big bowl win. Chad Kelly has another year, which I think is going to be great for Shea Patterson, as you mentioned. And now we go to Jeff Gray from Red Cup Rebellion, who I'm assuming it has to be a great day to be an Ole Miss fan. Jeff, agree or disagree?
It was a little bit better before Jeff Simmons announced the state, but other than that, it's going pretty well.
All right, and who jumps out to you right now? Obviously, Shea Patterson and Greg Little get, rightfully so, the majority of the attention when you look at this class. But beyond those two, who do you feel like is sort of the crown jewel group of this class?
Well, the big kind of shocker today was A.J. Brown, who's a 4-star receiver, who's from Starkville. So there's obviously, it's awesome we stole him off from Interstate, but he's also a really good receiver, and Freeze has compared him to Laquan Treadwell, and he is kind of that bigger body, and he's got some athleticism. I don't know if he's as good as Treadwell will end up, but we're really excited about having him, and the receiving class is now loaded. You throw in a couple 4-stars from last year as well, and Shea Patterson's really going to have some guys to throw to here in a couple of years. All
right, and aside from Greg Little, who seems to be the obvious choice as an early impact guy, who do you see as having the skills to come in and immediately, not necessarily start, but get into a meaningful rotation with Ole Miss in 2016?
Yeah, one is going to be a guy who actually hasn't signed yet today. He's committed. He's a West Coast guy, so he's coming a little later. It's a 4-star David Luipasaga. I think I might be pronouncing that right. He's a linebacker. Ole Miss is hurting bad at linebacker right now. We have both of our starters leaving from last year. And we're still waiting to hear on Miguel Juarez, the 5-star out of California, but we're not really holding our breath on him. So Luipasaga is going to be a guy that I think probably has the best chance, other than Little, to step in and be a starter from day one.
Excellent. Jeff? Continue. Yeah. Sorry.
And then, like I said, it's not so much that he's that much more skilled in the rest of the class. It's just, that's where we have the hole, particularly at linebacker.
Excellent. Jeff, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your signing day and hope it continues to go quite smoothly. Bud, Rashan Gary
is now a Michigan Wolverine. We are ready to call this.
Just committed. We are now officially ready to call the vote. The single vote is in.
We are ready to award Rashan Gary to Michigan here, the number 1 player in the country from Jersey. We're ready to
Yes.
call the top player from Jersey.
Yes. I wish we had some sort of interactive touchscreen Mac. Boop, 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 boop. Rashan Gary, what makes him so good? We have clips of him right here.
Okay, so he's about 285, 290 pounds, but he moves like he's 240. He has great length. But more importantly for me, Rashan Gary has all the physical abilities, like you see here, to knife into the backfield, to make that tackle, to split that double team, to rip that guy down. He has all the intangibles you want. He could play nose, he could play 3-tech, he could even play defensive end. But I tell you what really impressed me about Rashan Gary is that Rashan Gary busts his butt between reps. This is what you don't see in these highlight clips.
Right.
He hustles every single drill like a kid that has no offers, when in fact he has 50. Like, I've never seen a guy rated that highly who has that kind of hustle and that kind of drive. And you talk to anybody at these camps or even his coaches, he's extremely coachable. I think Rashan Gary is going to be an absolute superstar.
Yeah, and quite impressive when you look at his huddle and Michigan having their ridiculous ceremony today. So I'm assuming now there are fireworks and Nerf guns going on. I don't know what they're doing there.
I'd fly a banner.
Yeah, that's what you should do. One of those blimps, the indoor blimps, that's the way to go. So Rashan Gary, a Michigan Wolverine. So when you look across, and let's get back to the SEC for a moment before moving to the Big Ten. When you look across the SEC, did anybody surprise? Auburn certainly is in this conversation usually, not this year, at the top. Any surprises, any intriguing stories outside of the top 10, 15 teams?
I think you look at the disparity between the West and the East that continues. I mean, Tennessee had a nice day picking up Nigel Warrior. We don't know yet what Derek Brown will do as of this taping. Florida didn't really close very strong. Georgia missed out on Derek Brown, the number 1 player in Georgia. When Kirby Smart was hired, I expected them to lock him down. They didn't. The West keeps cleaning up. Alabama adds a number of prospects today. Ole Miss, like you said, added A.J. Brown and Deontay Anderson. LSU picked up a couple studs. The East is kind of lacking a little bit. The West is just so loaded. I mean, Auburn picked up 2 really good players today, and yet we're not even really talking about them because they're overshadowed a little bit within their own division.
Fair to say the shine may be a little bit off Texas A&M after these past few years finishing in the top 10?
Yeah, well, look, I call it new coach smell.
Okay.
Right? When you come on as a coach, that first full recruiting class, not the one that you have like 3 months to work on before you sign,
right,
but the next one and then the one after that, those kind of first 2 full recruiting classes are where you got to make your money. You got to get the studs, and then you got to develop them. Because when you're first there, nobody can check your promises against what you've actually done on the field at that place.
True.
So if you're not winning games, though, eventually they're like, well, coach, you're promising me this, but I'm watching this, and you guys aren't getting it done. Now, granted, you can only have one champion of the West, and we know who that pretty much is every year.
After year, yeah.
But I think the promises and the hype is starting to wear off a little bit for the Aggies because they're not getting it done on the field.
All right, and Arkansas, another team that traditionally these past couple seasons with Brett Bielema has finished the season quite strong. Do they have anybody at the top of their class that is ready to maybe help them win games in September?
Yeah, they have a really quality defensive lineman named McTelvin Agim.
Okay.
Remember this name. He's very versatile, a guy with great natural power in his hands and good quickness. You could play him on the inside. You could play him on the outside. It's kind of like a 5-shade. I really like McTelvin Agim. Great job to get him in that class.
All right, and with Agim's mention, we do have our 5, or this is Bud's top 5, which I happen to agree with. Early impact guys in the SEC, a lot of talent, unsurprisingly, coming in. Agim, of course, for Arkansas. Greg Little, we've mentioned. We'll get the list of names up here in a second. Marlon Davidson, we have not mentioned Auburn. What is it about Davidson that you like?
Marlon Davidson, great natural power in his hands. I mean, I just said the same thing about Agim, but it's true.
Okay.
Marlon Davidson, I like his balance. He's able to shed blockers. I know his brother is actually a staffer at Auburn, so that's why everybody was confident he was going to pick the Tigers. Great get for them out of Montgomery and an impact player for sure. Cleveland, by the way, I know Andy mentioned Percy Harvin perhaps. I would even compare him to like a Martavis Bryant.
Interesting.
And Florida, if you look at it, they have some playmakers on that team. The kid that got out of Booker T last year, but he's a little bit smaller. Cleveland is like a 6'4" type who can really sky to get the football. Now, he needs to add weight, but there's a reason I think he's going to be an impact player for Florida this year is because he has the ability to hit the home run, and they have to have somebody to throw the football to in the red zone.
Yeah, and speaking of throwing the football, Jacob Eason, you have him as the number 1 skilled player in the country at quarterback just because his tools are off the charts and he will compete in year 1. He's from the state of Washington. He sort of was concerned about the coaching change at Georgia. Ultimately, after taking a visit to Florida, keeps his commitment to Georgia. An unusual place for Georgia to get a quarterback, the state of Washington. What is it, as we see his clips here in a second, about Jacob Eason that makes him so special?
So, first of all, he's 6'5" and 200-something and will fill out and be even better. Decently athletic. But what I love about Jacob Eason is this. everybody looks good when they're throwing with no pressure around them.
Right.
Jacob Eason makes ridiculous throws under pressure, and when he's off, Trent Dilfer uses the term off platform, right? So if he's leaning one way, he can throw the ball from multiple arm angles, sidearm, over the top.
Yeah, as you
pretty
see
good
here,
touch.
yeah.
I mean, see, look, his offensive line is not that good. No offense, guys. But I mean, he's having to make a lot of difficult throws here where he's under pressure, throwing on the run here. Look at that touch to drop it over that defender right there where only his receiver can catch it. Here off the play action on the rollout, fading away because he's got pressure in his face, yet he's still able to get the football down there.
And he very much will have pressure in his face at Georgia, especially as a young quarterback.
There's no doubt. They do have Sam Pittman as their offensive line coach, who is an excellent addition to Georgia's staff, in my opinion. But the games are not won and lost when you have no pressure around you. Those are blowout games.
Yes.
Tight games are won and lost in the crunch when you actually have pressure at your feet. You got to make a throw off balance when I really need it. Jacob Eason has to learn about reading defenses. He's got to learn about what throws he can and can't make in that league. But there's no doubt he can make ridiculous tosses when he needs to.
Yeah, and the advantage of having Jim Chaney, who has succeeded at so many places as an offensive coordinator, making his way to Athens. And Georgia's class, aside from Jacob Eason, is he armed with offensive line talent? Is he armed with receiving talent? Running back talent? Certainly with Nick Chubb coming back, he has that returning. But what are the players like around him within Georgia's class?
So I think the most impressive player in Georgia's class for him to throw the ball to is a kid named Mecole Hardman, who committed today. He was kind of trying to give everybody the head fake as to where he's going to go. We were like, Mecole, you're going to Georgia. Let's be real here.
Yes.
Kid with just blazing speed, excellent acceleration, good change of direction. I think Georgia should use him on some fly sweeps and kind of like they use Isaiah McKenzie, who also returned punts for them. Mecole could do that as well. A really special guy with great speed.
And a first-year coach in Kirby Smart. Other than the Derek Brown thing, you like the class that he's put together?
I do. I feel like it's a good class. Now, next year's going to be very important, like we talked about. New coach smell. You got to get that bump from when you first arrive because you're selling playing time, you're selling opportunity, you're selling your vision for the program. Georgia has to really. That's a great state to be in. I mean, it's probably the third or fourth most talented state in the country. Georgia has to do a better job next year of locking it down, but it's a good start.
Okay, and one of the things we've talked about in the past is the SEC and perhaps not having a group of quarterbacks as talented as some other conferences. A number of quarterbacks. First of all, was it a good year for quarterbacks nationally?
It was a good year for pro-style quarterbacks.
Okay.
I do not think it was a good year for dual-threat quarterbacks, which is interesting. I feel like there are 4 or 5 pro-style kids who are better probably than the group of dual-threat kids. That's just kind of how the cookie crumbles some year.
Right.
You have Shea Patterson, you have Eason, and not that those guys aren't mobile, but they're not guys who the defense is like, man, we really got to worry about this dude's legs, as opposed to like maybe a John Franklin, the junior college kid who's coming to Auburn this year. In the SEC, you have to worry about his legs.
Yes.
Patterson and Eason can get out of trouble, but they're primarily pocket passers first and foremost.
Right, Jarek Guarantano, locally New Jersey, heading to Tennessee.
Very athletic kid. Now, I think he's listed as a pro-style passer. I would almost rather say Jarrett is a dual-threat kid.
Okay.
Because Tennessee does run the quarterback, as we've seen with Josh Dobbs, and I think they'll use his legs to threaten the defense quite a bit.
And something a lot of coaches like, with quarterbacks especially, is an ability to play other sports. In South Carolina, speaking of new coach Shine, Will Muschamp brings in a highly rated dual-threat guy in Brandon McElwain, who is an excellent baseball player.
Highly rated, as in, I think one service had him as the number 6 overall player in the country, which means Brandon McElwain passed on a sure multi-million-dollar signing bonus to go play with Carolina.
Were you almost going to say load of money?
I thought about it, but then we're on live TV here, Dan.
We are on live. We are the internet. You cannot curse on the internet. That is a thing that happens. And Missouri, another team that actually they flipped an Alabama commit later on in the process. Another team with a new coach. Missouri has succeeded so much on the defensive side of the ball. Did they make any noise this cycle?
They did pick up a player from Alabama who flipped late, and as we saw, Nick Saban was trying to make room. But I think that the interesting thing with Missouri is that they were kind of going into the Southeast more, right? Once they joined the SEC, but now they're actually going to go and go into Texas more. Their new coach says, I want to focus. I was talking to Bill Connolly, who runs Rock M Nation on our great Missouri site, and he said they're going to go back into Texas more. And Texas is now a very hotly contested SEC battleground along with the Big 12. I mean, Ole Miss goes into Texas. LSU goes into Texas, especially in the Houston area. Bama has shown they can go into Texas. Will the SEC East teams be able to go into Texas? I guess Missouri, since they're technically kind of the westernmost SEC East team, will be the interesting test case.
Yeah, and Missouri, obviously a brand name that's known to Texas because of the Big 12 and the recent success that they had within that conference. So not totally new. It makes sense. Anybody disappoint you within the SEC?
I don't know about disappointing. I feel like the magic that Vanderbilt had with James Franklin is just probably not coming back. That seems to be a very special situation with some unique circumstances around it that allowed that to happen. They don't seem to be signing that many elite prospects. Ole Miss continues to put distance between themselves and Mississippi State, and look, that's just kind of how that's probably going to be. Somebody has to finish last in the SEC West in recruiting.
Right.
Somebody's got to finish first. Somebody's got to finish last. They're not doing that great of a job. I feel like Dan Mullen gets a bad rep. I think he's a good recruiter. It's just hard to get kids to Starkville.
Year in and year out, it is a difficult chore. And Kentucky and Mark Stoops had been getting a lot of attention these past couple of years. In his first couple of years, have they come close to matching that?
I feel like they are consistently doing what they did under Mark Stoops in his first year, but I'm not sure there's a next step for them to take on the recruiting trail until they start winning more games on the field. They have to put the W's up for the kids to believe, hey, if I go to Kentucky, I'm going to be developed. We're going to have a shot, at least a chance to play for the SEC East title. They had a chance to knock off Florida last year. They had a chance for some other big wins. Fell just short. We'll have to see what Mark and those guys can do next year on the field.
All right, we're going to speak to Anthony from Maize and Brew, our terrific Michigan site, shortly. So Big Ten, it doesn't feel right to say it, but it feels accurate to say it. Michigan and Ohio State and everyone else. Where is that right? Where is that wrong?
It's wrong in that the gap between Michigan and Ohio State and, let's say, Penn State and Michigan State
I should include Michigan State
not
there, yeah.
huge. I mean, Penn State, I really like the top of Penn State's class. It's correct, though, in that the national attention being given to Michigan and Ohio State certainly seems to be kind of dwarfing everybody else in that conference. And if you're Michigan State, you're sitting there thinking, we've won so many games.
What about
on the
us?
Field. We're really good at scouting, and now other more talented players, or actually rated as more talented, are starting to look at Michigan State and commit to them. But at the same time, Michigan's overshadowing them. Ohio State's overshadowing Penn State in that league. I think the real thing that stands out, though, take those four and look at all the other teams in that league.
The next 10.
Would you rather have a combined team of the four classes that I just mentioned, or the other 10 teams in the Big, or the other 8 teams in the Big Ten? I don't know.
It's certainly at the top, and where the difference is between teams with and without talent seems to be along the defensive line. And Ohio State and now Michigan, with the addition of Rashan Gary, really distancing themselves. Ohio State bringing in 2 great defensive linemen in Nick Bosa and Jonathan Cooper. What is it about Michigan and Ohio State and the players that they've targeted that are so different?
I feel like they have better top-end talent, and they also have great depth in these classes. There's no doubt. But Ohio State getting a Jonathan Cooper, who I think could be an instant impact guy on passing downs. Is he a linebacker? Is he a defensive end? I don't care. He's a pass rusher. He's relentless. He has moves. He has some great balance, true ability to bend when he goes along the edge. I think he can do a great job. Obviously, we know about Nick Bosa. His brother is kind of famous and will probably be talked about at this very desk here when we do NFL Draft Show in a couple months. A special player as well, getting him out of Aquinas. And then Michigan getting Rashan Gary, who we just talked about. I think the no doubt best player in this class. And
Michigan certainly doing much more than just going after defensive linemen. They get a quarterback of the future in Brandon Peters, another guy you like a lot, who's actually at Michigan's ceremony today. What is it about Brandon Peters that jumps out to you?
Good athleticism, a little bit raw. He's a former basketball player, but I like Peters' arm a whole lot. I'm going to be honest here. I like that Harbaugh likes him. I think Jim Harbaugh has good success with quarterbacks. There are certain coaches, if Mark D'Antonio likes a defensive back, I'm probably going to like that defensive back. If Jim Harbaugh or like a Jimbo Fisher likes a QB, or Mark Richt, I'm going to look at that. I'm going to say, okay,
they see
something. You're Michigan. You could pick, for the most part, any kid in the country. And they missed on KJ Costello, who went to Stanford and was their pick over Peters. But okay, so you lose on him. You're still going to pick almost anybody else in the country you want.
Right.
This is the kid you settled on. Prototypical pro-style guy with a little bit of athleticism, 6'4", 6'5", big-time arm, raw, but he can be very good for Michigan.
All right, and speaking of the Wolverines, we now bring in Anthony Broom of Maize and Brew. So good day to be a Michigan Wolverine. I imagine a lot of them are, or at least a weird day because of Jim Harbaugh. But to you, who jumps off the page following the Rashan Gary announcement as the crown jewel of this Michigan class, and what are your general thoughts?
Well, we're talking crown jewels. It's definitely Rashan Gary. I think that sort of starts and ends there. But I mean, it's been a good day for them already. They've had commitments from the nation's top kicker in Quinn Nordine, a nice pickup defensive back Lavert Hill, fight with Michigan State for him. We thought they'd be able to finish this class on a high note. Michigan classes of the past that sort of, we've seen them be in on these big guys and sort of sputter down the stretch. But, it's been a huge day for them and capped off by the Rashan Gary news about 20 minutes ago.
It's certainly a transition still from the Brady Hoke regime to Jim Harbaugh and his staff. Who do you think in this class specifically can come in and play the way that Harbaugh and his staff want to play sooner rather than later?
Well, again, I think Gary is the guy they can plug in. He's probably looks like a good bet. He could be a day one starter. Willie Henry left for the NFL, so I think he could sort of slide into that spot. Defensive backs is David Long and Lavert Hill. I think they could be in the quarterback rotation. They've got two pretty good ones still in Jordan Lewis and Channing Scribbling, but I think those guys can play early. Obviously, Kareem Walker, they have the number one running back in the class, too. I'm not sure. Think he'll get a fair amount of carries. Not ready to call him the starter yet or anything, but, he's a guy that can contribute early. And, those are the kind of guys they need to really take it to that next level. You see, the Alabamas, the Ohio States of the world get these guys on the field early and making, out there making plays. While it was a pretty veteran-laden group last year and going into next year, I think Michigan needed to add some of those guys, and I think they have in this class.
And Michigan certainly has quarterbacks on the roster already who will be battling for the starting job following a very nice second half of the season for Jake Rudock. How close is Brandon Peters? Do you anticipate him as sort of a 100% lock to redshirt, or do you think he has enough tools to compete at least for the starting job this fall?
I certainly think he has the tools to compete. Harbaugh's shown that he's not a guy that hoards red shirts. If he thinks a guy can play, he's going to play. So if he performs at the level where he can be out there this year, I wouldn't put it past him. But I still think that John O'Korn is probably the front runner there. They have a couple other guys in the depth chart, but I think O'Korn is probably the front runner at quarterback, and Peters is there now. We'll be practicing in spring football. We'll see what kind of steps he's able to make. I know I heard Bud a few minutes before say he still thinks he's kind of raw. I would agree with that. I think he has some work to do, but if he's ready to play, he'll be out there. That's just kind of the way Jim Harbaugh does.
All right, Anthony, thank you very much for your time. And by all means, everybody out there looking to see what Michigan does during the recruiting cycle,
If I can weigh in on one more Michigan
please do.
If we got time, looking at the schedule here.
We're good.
Michael Onwenu is a guy who could play at nose, you could play at guard. This guy, he's squatty, he's like 8 feet wide, but not sloppy fat. Great bend, though. He's basically impossible to move on defense.
That's what you need.
And he roaches people on offense. That is the type of guy that Harbaugh had at Stanford. That when you think Michigan football,
right,
with the offensive line, that's your road grader. They got that guy. He's the dude you run behind on 4th and 1 when you need a yard.
So he will become best friends with Kareem Walker sooner rather than later.
Indeed.
Fair enough.
The battles between him and Rashan Gary could be excellent in practice.
Those are going to be fun. Ohio State is hard to not mention right after Michigan. We're going to talk about them with Luke Zimmerman here in a minute, but we talked about the defensive line talent. We've been talking about quarterbacks, and we have not mentioned Dwayne Haskins. A relatively late flip. You do not see quarterbacks committing generally this late in the process from Maryland following the coaching change for the Terps. What are your thoughts about Dwayne Haskins?
Maryland decided that it was worth it to them to risk losing Haskins and all those other studs that were committed to Maryland when they decided to fire Randy Edsall and with him Mike Loxley.
Right.
This is what happens. Kids, they don't really commit to schools. They say they do, but it's about the relationship with the coaches. And so that's the reason Maryland lost Haskins, or at least one of them. Obviously, Ohio State's a better program than Maryland. I don't think I'm shocking anybody by saying that. Haskins, I feel like, has really good touch when he throws the football. He has the arm to get it there. I thought he threw the out route exceptionally well. I want to see him throw a little bit better when he's throwing to his left. When he throws to his right, he's really good. At least that's what I observed this year when I was watching him in 7-on-7. Athletic kid, good build. I also think he has room to continue growing and can become even stronger. A really good get for Urban Meyer. I want to see how they use him within the context of Urban's offense, because I've always seen Urban's offense as being best when it has a guy who's a true run threat at quarterback. Right. Haskins is athletic, but I don't really think of him as like a dynamic runner.
Right.
They did a good job with J.T. Barrett, who's a good runner, but not a great runner. I think that's probably the mold they'll go with Haskins.
Interesting. Yeah, he certainly does seem to have a number of tools as a polished passer, and he won't be asked to do much. He's, J.T. Barrett's back, and he will be a dynamic threat once again. And we are now joined, speaking of Ohio State, Luke Zimmerman of Land Grant, Holy Land, and of SB Nation. Luke's a happy guy generally, but it must be a great day to be Luke Zimmerman.
It's not too bad.
What are your thoughts as a not too bad day that you're having? What are your thoughts about this Ohio State class that we see in front of us and how well Urban Meyer and his staff did to address the needs of the Buckeyes?
No, I know this is going to blow some minds, but Urban Meyer did pretty well at recruiting once again. This is his 5th class at Ohio State, which sounds absolutely crazy even to Ohio State fans because it doesn't seem like it's been that long at all. And even though I guess like some of the names in this class may not have some of the low to high 5-star cachet, maybe some thinking back to Urban Meyer's earlier classes, Von Bell, Ezekiel Elliott, Joey Bosa, and some of those 4 and 5-star type guys. It's just got a lot of really solid players. I think a lot of guys that are going to not only help replace the huge mass exodus of players they had that went to the NFL draft this season and graduated, but also just I think kind of help new defensive coordinator Greg Schiano, how weird is that, to really kind of help put his fingerprints on the Ohio State defense.
Who is the talent, who is the most tantalizing talent in this class that you just cannot wait to see in scarlet and gray on the field and what he can do either within the Ohio State offense or defense?
Well, I think the big name is the 1 5-star guy, which is Joey Bosa's kid brother, Nick Bosa. Nick would be an absolute slam dunk that everyone that wears scarlet and gray on Saturdays would be excited to watch. But he did suffer a major injury his senior year in high school. So I think like seeing, how soon will he be able to make an impact and what's he going to be like when he comes back from injury? I mean, if he's wired anything like his brother, this is only going to be a little bit of a setback for him, and maybe it'll delay when he gets onto the field. And his brother didn't really play until I want to say like October of his freshman year, but then was sort of a mainstay as a rotational defensive end for the rest of the year. But a lot of guys have said that Nick, at the same age as Joey, is further along. So if he can get past his injury I think he's going to be a really special player.
And right before you came on, we were talking about Dwayne Haskins, of course, the late quarterback flip from Maryland. How do you see him fitting into Ohio State's offense, especially in the post-Tom Herman era where they did have most of their success using talents like Cardale Jones, Braxton Miller, J.T. Barrett? How does he fit in as perhaps not the most, he's a quarterback that is dual threat, but he is not a burst runner. How does he fit in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure as you guys and a lot of folks have gotten that, he's a lot different from those kind of quarterbacks that have had success, with Urban Meyer and Tom Herman before the current offensive brain trust of Tim Beck and Ed Warner. But even though he's not, a run-first guy, I mean, I don't want to undersell his athleticism. He is athletic, and even though he is kind of more of a pocket passer, he can still make some moves. And Alex Smith, he's not. But I think, Urban Meyer has by and large, outside of some headache-inducing sequences and sort of overthinking play calling this past fall, done a pretty good job of adapting his offense to the guy that he has. So I think it should, I think Ohio State should be in great hands whenever J.T. Barrett moves on to the next level. And Haskins certainly has all the attributes to kind of become that, first really pass-first guy that's worked for Meyer's offenses, at least since like Bowling Green.
Excellent. Luke Zimmerman, Land Grant, Holy Land, thank you very much for your time. When you look around the rest of the Big Ten, Bud Elliott, we talked about Michigan State and how attractive they've become to players, especially on the defensive side of the ball. Penn State, James Franklin has always recruited well. You like the top of their class, but how do you evaluate Penn State as a whole and what they've done?
I feel like, and Penn State fans hated this when I said this on Twitter about a month ago,
but
I like the top of Penn State's class a whole lot. I mean, Miles Sanders, Monet, and Simmons are beasts. Also, Daniel Joseph has some pretty sick film at tight end as well, not only as playing defensive end. But the middle of the class, the bottom of the class, I think that's where we start to see some separation from Ohio State and Michigan compared to Penn State. Now, if you're Penn State, what you got to do is win ball games.
Yes.
Because your window to give kids promises is now going to be kind of closing a little bit because they're going to be able to see what you've done on the field. And what you've done on the field, admittedly under some unique circumstances, following Joe Pa is a situation pretty much like unlike any other. But kids are now saying, are you going to win games at Ohio State? Are you going to compete with Michigan? Or are you going to win games at Penn State? Are you going to compete with the big boys in that conference? Because if you're not, you will probably see the recruiting stay at this level and not at the very top of the conference.
Any other pieces you like within the conference? Michigan State, we talked about how well they've done on defense. They do bring in a couple of really good receivers as well to give their future offense a boost of athleticism. Certainly the last game they played, they scored this many points. So they will get better on offense even without Connor Cook. How do you evaluate what Michigan State was able to do in, I think, a surprising top 10-ish year?
Sure. I like Josh King. I like Donnie Corley, who has great versatility, could play corner, could play receiver. Messiah DeWeaver, the quarterback of Michigan State.
Great name.
I got to give, number one, great name. Number two, I got to give this kid some credit. When I saw him as a sophomore, I was not impressed. I was like, why are the Ohio folks that I trust hyping this kid? And they were right, because he became a lot better as a junior and as a senior. The mechanics got cleaned up. It seemed like he was much more comfortable delivering the football, faster through his reads. He just looked better. So good job by Michigan State getting on this kid early and having faith that he would come around and really become a much better player. He's one of the most improved kind of nationally known QBs, in my opinion, from the junior to the senior year.
Any other pieces that you like from recruiting classes across the Big Ten? Certainly Lamar Jackson committed the last couple days for Nebraska, the defensive
number one
back.
safety in the country by a lot of people.
He is a ridiculous talent. Any other pieces that schools have done? Iowa obviously coming off of a very good year. That might not pay dividends until the next recruiting cycle.
There's a kid going to Minnesota, or I assume he's still going to Minnesota. I haven't checked in like the last 2 hours to see where he might have signed. But Dredrick Snelson, if he sticks with Minnesota, I think it's an interesting thing, because at first I felt like he was very overrated as a sophomore when the initial sophomore ratings come out. And by the way, folks, don't pay attention to sophomore ratings. It's way too early to do this. It's just to make money on people clicking on stuff on websites. I think he was like a top 10 player nationally when those came out. I thought that's ridiculous. There's no way. But he's a receiver who has good bulk. He's not real tall, probably 6 foot flat, maybe 210. Really good long speed. He has good track speed. So that's something Minnesota maybe doesn't have. Now, not the best hips. Maybe not always the best hands, like not the shiftiest guy, but on straight line routes, on getting the ball in his hands on like a jet sweep type thing, Dredrick Snelson could, if he signs with Minnesota, and I don't have it in front of me right now, he could be really good for them.
Interesting. Indiana, Iowa, Purdue, anybody?
Purdue kind of disappointing. And at this point, I know Indiana is pretty much, when you compare them to Purdue, they're dominating in the state right now. Wisconsin, I know, always does a good job scouting kids up there. Interesting to see kind of what happens next year after they lost Dave Aranda. Will that have an impact? Nebraska in their first year, I do think, won the Big Ten West recruiting battle. Now it's kind of the kiddie pool compared to the Big Ten East. I mean, you could put Penn State or Michigan State in the Big Ten West, and they would have by far the best recruiting class. But at this point, I think Nebraska is going to be the best recruiting team in the West, and they probably should be. And within the context of Nebraska being so far from talent, it's always a good job, because they do have to go to the West Coast, they have to go into Texas, they have to go into territories that are traditionally belonging to other schools within the same conference. And I think moving to the Big Ten has hurt them in Texas. Interesting. Big 12 obviously had a number of Texas teams. If you were a kid and you were going to commit to Nebraska a couple years ago, your family could see you play, Baylor, Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, Texas, reasonably, like driving distance. A&M, right. A lot of and Missouri. Yes. So a lot of these kids come from underprivileged families, right? And it's why geography matters so much more than fans think it should, because you just don't have the money to fly up and see your kid play a road game at Penn State if you're a family in Texas without a whole lot of means. You could drive somewhere pretty reasonably, but hotels and flights, those charges rack up. That's why it hurts to move to the Big Ten. If you're Nebraska and you're trying to recruit Texas. And speaking of distances, a big story of the recruiting offseason last year was Jim Harbaugh and the satellite camps that he was starting to run in the South. And I know Ohio State fans like to sort of laugh at that situation. Did it pay dividends for Michigan in this class? Do you see it paying dividends in further classes down the line? Yes and no. They ended up dropping several of the kids they took and Michigan dropped about everybody at some point. I think they dropped Dan. They dropped me. Back at Thanksgiving, but he's back. I've recovered Michigan fan again. Yeah. They did get Devin Bush Jr. Out of South Florida. I think it helped him. It didn't really help them get kids necessarily, but I think it helped raise their profile in certain areas. Now, it's interesting. The NCAA, or there's a motion, I believe, to kill these satellite camps, where you can't host camps outside of your own state. That would certainly not be good for Jim Harbaugh, but as long as you can do it, it's creative. I know Jim Harbaugh is trying to host spring practice at IMG Academy, which is the most talented high school in the country. That's genius. Yeah. It makes sense, and he's actually invited any coach, high school or college coach, to his camp. Right. He is pretty open with that, so it's certainly interesting. Is there a coach that you can even remember? Obviously, Pete Carroll brought a ton of attention to USC, but is there a coach that you can remember who is this sort of attention forward as Jim Harbaugh has been this cycle? Yes, and Michigan fans won't like this because it's Urban Meyer at Florida. Urban Meyer started something called Friday Night Lights. Yeah. Instead of most coaches want to do these camps, they want to evaluate kids, right? And Florida said, we can do that in the context of putting some trendy music up on the video board, playing all our highlights of our great players, making this more of a one-on-one style camp, really showcasing what these kids do. And it became a huge recruiting event. If you wanted to get noticed, you wanted to go ball out at Friday Night Lights in the middle of summer in Gainesville. It was hot as hell, and They did it, and it was a huge hit. I think they still do it at Ohio State. And that Urban Meyer really started the trend of the big schools doing some of the more showcase-type camps.
Interesting. Okay, fair enough. And we'll stay in the Midwest, even though they're sort of pseudo-ACC. Notre Dame, another very, very good class for the Irish. Brian Kelly, he wears boots sometimes. He shows off boots on Twitter sometimes. How do you like Notre Dame's class, certainly going after offensive linemen and offensive skill?
I like it a lot. Notre Dame's kind of like the forgotten, really good recruiting team out there this year. Nobody's talking about them. We talk about 6 or 7 other schools. Brian Kelly knows what he's doing, folks. He's a good coach. He's a really good evaluator of talent. I love their offensive tackle pair that they landed. They got Dalen Hayes, who's going to be a really good linebacker.
A USC decommit, Dalen Hayes? Yeah.
And they're going to be really, really good up front. We saw him this year with the tackle that went pro early. They're Ronnie Stanley.
Ronnie Stanley, yep.
Now you see, hey, they look what they did with Ronnie Stanley, a kid who wasn't the most polished player coming in a couple of years ago. If you're an offensive tackle, Notre Dame has a great chip to sell to you, right? And they're going to do very well.
Yeah, and they've had that defensive line chip. They've had that linebacker chip. It's been a while since there's been a quarterback chip, but still, Notre Dame doing well, and they just didn't get the attention of some other schools because they didn't do it on signing day.
Right.
They locked up a number of these kids going into signing day.
And now I've never heard an announcer say, well, this player committed to them on signing day, so that touchdown is worth an extra 1.5 here. I mean, just get the guys in the program, and it's great.
All right, and with that, we bring in Jamie Uyama from 1 Foot Down, and certainly SB Nation recruiting as well. We're going to have him on later on to talk about the Pac-12 on the second show. Jamie, Notre Dame's class, certainly top to bottom, looks very, very strong. Which names jump out to you as guys that are really, really representative of the great job Brian Kelly has done?
Well, for one, Chase Claypool, wide receiver out of Canada, the top kid from Canada this year. I know that's not saying a lot usually, but this kid is an outstanding prospect. 6'5", 215. I mean, he's just a beast. He averages about close to 50 points a game playing basketball right now, and just absolutely dominated at his level up in Canada. But competed at the opening as well, and did really well there. And he's really a freak of nature, someone that they can chuck the ball to on the outside. Dalen Hayes is a guy who's early enrollee, already on campus, who's a former USC commit out of Ann Arbor, Michigan. Really talented kid. Hasn't played a lot of football in the last couple of years because of a transfer and injury, but really just a super athletic kid who's coming in kind of as a linebacker, defensive end hybrid, but he's probably going to get too big and end up being an edge rusher, which is a spot they really badly needed in this class. And then Tommy Kramer. Notre Dame has done a tremendous job recruiting on the offensive line under Harry Hiestand, and Tommy Kramer is their top O-line prospect they're bringing in. He's a composite 4-star, but a 5-star in a couple different services. Just a mean kid. Couldn't be a nicer kid off the field, but a mean kid on the field. Really did a great job at the Army Bowl, and just really impressive kid in terms of his feet, and just he's a technician for a guy his age and his development.
And the Irish have certainly suffered some big losses on both sides of the ball to the NFL. Any of these guys look like they could compete early on for rotation spots? And how well of a job do you think Brian Kelly and the staff did in addressing the sort of openings on the depth chart?
Well, I think they did a really good job in two areas specifically, because defensive end, I already mentioned Hayes. Khalid Kareem is another kid who was a 4-star kid, another kid out of Michigan, was former Alabama commit. He's a kid who I think is going to play right away. They really need someone in there. They're losing Romeo Okwara there. I'm not sure if he's going to start, but he's probably someone who's going to be in the rotation. They actually picked up Romeo's brother, Julian Okwara, is another 4-star kid out of North Carolina. Really talented edge rusher prospect. I don't know if he's going to be ready for a full-time role, but could be someone who's a nickel rusher, early in his career. And then they were losing a lot in the secondary, and really loaded up in the secondary this year. Another early enrollee kid, Devin Studstill, out of Florida, same high school as Tavon Coney, a guy who played a little bit for Notre Dame this year as a true freshman, and is probably going to step into Jalen Smith's shoes actually at Will Lineberger. But Studstill's a guy that, was only a 3-star kid, but really underrated. I thought someone who really flew under the radar. Notre Dame was in on him really early and really pursued him heavily and made him a top priority. And I think he's going to be a kid who plays right away. And they brought in quite a few other defensive backs as well that I think, are at least going to have a chance to compete for playing time in the near future.
Jamie, thank you very much for your time, and love what the folks over there at One Foot Down do, covering Notre Dame all year long. Easy transition to the ACC at this point. Another very good year atop the ACC, especially if you include pseudo Notre Dame into that group. Florida State, I don't know if they're the number one class at the moment. I don't know if you have that in front of them, but if not, they're right there.
I think they are. We're waiting on to see if Bama's going to sign Terrell Hall and also Mac Wilson.
Excellent. Okay. So Florida State, Clemson, you've mentioned earlier that at the top of their class, excellent talent, and Miami and a number of schools with new coaches. Certainly an interesting recruiting cycle as they scramble to try to fill out their class. What do you think of the ACC and what they've been able to do thus far?
I think they've done a nice job. NC State's done a good job. Louisville's done a good job. Obviously, you mentioned Miami. Miami did a very good job in the state of Florida. Now, they did lose some talented players to Tennessee today, unfortunately for them, but they kept Amon Richards, who we know Alabama wanted very badly. That's a big-time impact receiver for the Hurricanes. Florida State obviously just came back and kicked butt. So did Clemson. I really love the top of Clemson's class, like you said. They have so many guys who I think are both rated highly and then almost even underrated. I mean, they're number two player in the entire country. Big time impact defensive lineman. Clemson has done a great job.
Yeah. Let's actually take a look at Dexter Lawrence in a moment here, just because at the size that he plays at and the way he's able to move and disrupt everything on offense, you know which
he's
one
like a 50-gallon drum with legs and turbo rocket boosters here. Just a big time able to get in the backfield. That's a 345-pound man chasing down a receiver down the field. Look, not that the competition in North Carolina is that good, but this is just hopeless. Like they have no shot to block this kid at all. He's just so much bigger and stronger than everybody else. And the thing is, you look at him, he's kind of young in the face, man. He might get bigger and stronger. They could pair him with Christian Wilkins, who we spoke about on this show last year when he signed another excellent 5-star offensive tackle to create. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if Clemson has the best pair of defensive tackles in the country.
Excellent. All right, and with that, we're now joined by Ben Burrows of Shaken the Southland, our excellent Clemson community. So we mentioned the top of this class, Ben, as being particularly excellent nationally. How do you evaluate the class as a whole and what Dabo's been able to do post-national championship game and through the recruiting cycle as a whole?
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for having me on. We're a bit lugubrious, I guess, at Clemson. We thought we had a serious shot, not just a puncher's chance, but a serious shot at landing Rashan Gary to have, maybe the best defensive front in the nation. But, the two storylines, I think, are, Clemson riding, like you said, the playoff momentum, and Clemson's kind of establishing itself as a national brand, right? We went out and continued to mine Florida. We've gone to Kansas, competed in New Jersey. Clemson's really becoming a national brand. And the second big thing that Clemson needs to do to be able to get back to the playoff is kind of reload on defense, because we lost so many players to the draft, some of them unexpectedly. We lost Mackenzie Alexander, Curse, and T.J. Green. So right here at the end, we made this push of landing about 4 defensive backs that are pretty good and should help us at least somewhat next year with Trayvon Mullen, and a really big safety, which we kind of Brent Venables really likes that in his system. Isaiah Simmons, a guy out in Kansas who's 6'4" and at 215 is going to fill that mold. And Kevon Wallace, who's kind of an underrated player. So we've tried to do that in replenishing the secondary so that we can reload for the national championship run again.
What do you think of Tavian Feaster and the job that he might be able to do in a rotation? Of course, Wayne Gallman back, but what he might be able to do for Clemson in the immediate future?
Well, so Feaster is one of the more polarizing prospects, I think, in the country, because, here's a guy who rushes for 1,000 yards during his season, but he also, receives 1,000 yards as well. And so he's both a threat out of the backfield and running the ball, which I think would be a really good complement to Gallman. And so if there's anybody on the offensive side of the ball that's going to make an impact on a loaded Clemson offense next year, it's going to be Tavian Feaster kind of coming in situationally. I mean, he had laser time 4.34 speed. That's something that Clemson hasn't had at running back lately. Gallman's a great back. Adam Choice is a great back, but I think there'll be a role for Feaster. Some people thought that he's too injured or he's not competing enough at all-star games and things. But I think once he gets to Clemson, once he gets locked in, he'll do a really good job.
Excellent. Ben, thank you very much for your time. Very excited to see what this Clemson class can do next year as they fill in for a number of players gone from a really, really excellent national championship contending team. Florida State. We are at that time of the show where we dip our toes into the waters of Tallahassee. First of all, what's not to like about this Florida State class?
They could probably have used one more elite corner, I guess.
Okay.
I think they would have liked to take 2 receivers if they had gotten the ones that they wanted. And Nate Craig Myers went to Auburn.
Right.
Second straight year, the top player from Tampa has gone to Auburn following Byron Cowart last year.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, you get 2 impact defensive tackles.
Yes.
You get some pass rushers. You needed linebackers. You got 4 of them.
Mm-hmm.
You got 3 corners that you really love. They did lose Jamel Cook to USC,
right,
who may or may not end up playing receiver out there, which is interesting. Florida State wanted him at safety. Offensive line is arguably the best offensive line class in the country.
Wow.
They lost Isaac Nada to Georgia, who was the number 1 tight end committed to FSU for a while, and they ended up getting Nasir Upshur, which is a nice replacement if you can't have Nada. And then at quarterback, Malik Henry's not rated as the number 1 player or number 1 quarterback in the country. I think he's down at 5 or 6, which is still highly rated. But this is the guy Jimbo picked.
Right, you mentioned this.
He had pretty much all these guys through his camp. Jacob Eason was there. I was there that day at camp. The day he had Jacob Eason and Malik Henry, he liked Malik Henry better.
Interesting.
That's who they like, and that's who they picked.
Okay, and what is it about Malik Henry that has him deserving of being talked about among the nation's best quarterbacks?
Good arm, good accuracy. I think it's the feel for how much velocity and how much touch to put on the football. He seems to be able to make throws from different platforms, decently mobile, very football smart.
Okay.
You only saw 2 guys in All-Star games this year that actually looked good, in my opinion. And All-Star games are very difficult for quarterbacks because you have offensive lines who don't play together and they get blown up. So you get guys have to deal with pressure, and the dudes who succeed in All-Star games are typically those who get the ball out on time to their receivers in rhythm.
Right.
Shea Patterson did it. Malik Henry did it. Nobody else really did it consistently. And I'm not a big, hey, let's All-Star games sing the praises here. But it does show that he's very football smart and he's ready to come in and compete. And he will this spring for Florida State because Sean McGuire is out with an ankle injury. So it's going to be Henry and DeAndre Francois.
And who stands out to you as being physically, mentally, whatever elsely ready to play in Tallahassee? You've mentioned a couple of guys, but who is ready because of openings, especially at Florida State?
So Florida State was very young in 2015. And they really didn't lose hardly anybody off that roster. Levante Taylor is a guy, though, who I do expect to come in, play a couple hundred defensive snaps, if not start, and immediately be the starting punt returner. I think that he is the most dynamic returner in the country. I know we're going to see his film here in a second. You look at Levante Taylor here, a just absolute playmaker. Imagine Greg Reed with a couple inches more muscle and just better playmaking ability as well. Better top end speed, I think, than Greg here. Here we're seeing them actually in the state title game. They're playing in Virginia Stadium. This punt return is just sick. I mean, he just nobody touches him, no chance.
And that's where you expect him to have
I think that
noticeable results.
Florida State's punt return game has not been very good for 3 or 4 years.
Okay.
He is going to be a really good punt returner for them immediately, in my opinion.
Yeah, an incredibly impressive huddle film from Levante Taylor. As you look at the rest of the ACC, obviously the big offseason narrative has been new coaches. Mark Richt goes to Miami. They finished with what looks to be a very nice class. Certainly, I saw a quote from somewhere. You don't want to be the school that receives the first commitment from a South Florida recruit.
Very true. South Florida is kind of a world unto its own.
Right.
Some of these kids decommit 4 or 5 times. They have ceremonies to announce a top 3 or a top 10, which is ridiculous. But that's what we do. We also have open transfer season down there.
Yes.
You can pretty much transfer whatever high school you want, and the state doesn't have resources to really check that. So there's literally you could transfer high schools and make super schools.
So with that said, how good of a job did Mark Richt do, obviously getting in late in the process, his alma mater, in keeping some of Al Golden's recruits and building upon them?
I'd probably give him a B or a B+.
Okay.
If he had kept Tyler Bird, if he had kept a couple of the guys that left that class, he did keep Sam Bruce away from Ohio State, which was a big-time win for the Hurricanes there. Miami wants to compete with Florida State. Right now, the gap in recruiting is pretty big. The key for Mark Richt, just like it's going to be for Kirby Smart, where Mark just left, how do you do in that first full recruiting class? Next year, Miami has to hit this out of the park if they're going to go on an upward trajectory and take advantage of the new renovations that have been made to Sun Life Stadium.
All right, and you look around the rest of the ACC, North Carolina, an uncharacteristically but a really nice year for North Carolina, basically a quarter away from perhaps making the playoff, and they recruited very well under Butch Davis. How have they done under Larry Fedora this cycle?
They've done well. I think North Carolina is an underrated recruiting staff. In fact, I see Carolina offer kids, and then a couple months later or a couple weeks later, bigger staffs will come in there and offer the kid, especially at linebacker. I think they do well in the Jacksonville area, but we saw in the bowl game that they're going to need some defensive help there, especially when you run that many offensive snaps. Your defense gets tired. You need defensive depth, defensive reinforcements, a first and second wave that can play. They did a really good job of bulking up this year with numbers on the defensive side of the football.
All right, Virginia Tech, 2 hires I think a lot of people like. Again, not a lot of time to secure a class, but near a lot of talent in that sort of Tidewater region on the ocean in Virginia. Did they do anything that you particularly liked?
Not really. And I don't want to take away from the hires here because I think that they made pretty clear upgrades on the coaching side of things. I mean, we all think Justin Fuente is a better coach than the most recent
end
addition.
Of Frank Beamer's,
correct.
Tenure,
now, Mike London, very good recruiter, never put it together on the field. Obviously, Bronco Mendenhall is a proven winner.
Yes.
I still think those hires are very good, but if you're asking me, did they do anything on the recruiting trail? Did they really create any hype? Not really. 2 more guys that really have to get it in gear next year. Otherwise, the hype's going to wear off totally.
And Louisville's won a BCS game, but they've had to go into other states, namely Florida, to succeed with Charlie Strong. Now they have Bobby Petrino and his staff. They finished the season in a mostly positive way. Lamar Jackson looks very good at quarterback. How did they do on the recruiting trail?
They did well. Now, Louisville, unfortunately, is kind of in this whole Michigan State, Penn State thing where it's like, I really wish I wasn't in this division.
Right.
Can we get into the Coastal? That'd be nice.
Yes.
Desmond Fitzpatrick there, they beat out Nebraska for him, a big-time signature, a playmaker. I think Louisville does a really good job of scouting and figuring out what kids it can get into school and then taking some chances on some kids, and it turns out, and they send them to the NFL. Louisville is a very formidable number 3 team in that division.
Excellent. All right. And with that, we have some questions from Facebook. We are streaming live, both on YouTube Live and on Facebook. This comes from Cody Allen Rice. What do you think about Tom Herman and Houston's expectations next year? So let's start with the job he's done recruiting, because that's right now the big story. But what do you think this spells for next year as well?
I think that they signed a defensive tackle this year who is going to come in and play immediately. Ed Oliver, who every school in the country wanted, a great penetrator, a guy who, look, if you're in the AAC, you got to double team this kid, even though he's a freshman. And he's going to face a lot of double teams, but he's also going to make you divert a lot of your resources to them, because you just don't see that quality of player typically in the AAC, especially not as a freshman. Now, some of them clearly they'll develop along the line.
Right.
Tom Herman is almost recruiting too well. This is going to get him noticed. There are some schools in Texas that are not maybe achieving as much on the field as they would like to. Tom Herman just signed his extension, but if you're an oil baron, I'm not sure that's going to stop you if you want Tom Herman.
Yeah, fair enough. And if you are going to be a team that's not a Power 5 conference team, the lesson again, be in East Texas, because you are around a ton of great talent. The next one comes from Joshua Parsons. Did Tennessee do enough to keep their own upward trajectory in the SEC East?
They did.
Okay.
They signed Nigel Warrior today.
Yes.
A big-time get. They kept him away from Georgia, from Auburn, from Alabama. Obviously had a connection to Tennessee already, but a really impact safety. And just now, Dan, they signed Jonathan Kongbo, the number 1 junior college defensive end in the country. Beat out Bama, beat out Florida State, beat out Ole Miss, beat out USC. Yeah. Those are heavy hitters. And Tennessee came out on top.
What overall rank, this one's Josh Bailey, do you give to the Canes? I guess you sort of answered that. You said BB+, but a top 15-20 class?
Yeah, I think that a top 20 class is fair. I don't like grading coaches so much in their first year because they only had 3 months. And every situation you come into is different. I mean, he just now got his staff in there, 5-6 weeks ago.
Is it a good staff of recruiters?
I think it is, yes.
Okay.
I like Thomas Brown as our offensive coordinator. I think he's going to do a very good job there, a dynamic personality on the recruiting trail.
Manny Diaz as defensive coordinator, local to Miami, so knows the area.
And I think Mark Richt in Portland, let me say this, I think Al Golden struggled sometimes in that at first he almost alienated some of these high school coaches in the area.
Right.
We're going to offer who we're going to offer. And he really didn't have the cachet to do that.
True.
And then all of a sudden he kind of just started bowing to the pressure a little bit and offering kids maybe before Miami was ready to do so.
Okay.
And I think that hurt them some. That's a very vocal and influential high school football recruiting community. And you have to kind of have the guy with the chops to go in there and say, you know what, no. I'll offer your kid what I'm ready to offer your kid when we think he can help the Miami Hurricanes.
Right.
I think Mark Richt has the proven track record to do that.
Yeah, do you expect them moving forward? Has he done a good job reaching out, forming those relationships to make a top 10, 8 to 12 class next year?
It depends on what their numbers are going to look like. I don't know what they have graduating.
Right.
I think they certainly will see a higher overall quality of average recruit in the class next year.
All right, and based on some flips and in-state commits, this comes to us from Eric Russell. Who would you say is the biggest surprise move of the day? He mentioned Texas, which we're going to get into in the second show at 5 p.m. Eastern, but who is the surprise commitment of the morning?
Oh, surprise.
Was it A.J. Brown?
Yeah, it might have been A.J. Brown.
Fowler?
Just because, the Fowler thing you could see coming because we knew that his mom wanted him at Texas.
Okay.
And moms win a lot. A.J. Brown was interesting because of the fact that he is from Starkville, and it seemed like Ole Miss came on so late. And I know that Ole Miss has been recruiting him throughout the entirety of the recruiting process. But as far as you starting to really hear, A.J. Brown really might go, to Ole Miss. That was fairly new. I think Trayvon Mullen going to Clemson.
Okay.
Everybody thought LSU on this. And I know in talking to various staffs, Trayvon Mullen is a kid who really struggled to tell teams no. LSU thought they were getting Trayvon Mullen up until probably very late last night. Florida State thought they had an excellent shot. Louisville thought they had.
Wow.
Louisville. That's the extent to which Trayvon would give good feedback to everybody, and I believe that he genuinely did like those 4 schools. But most people didn't think it'd be Clemson, and Clemson ended up getting a great addition at cornerback to fill Mackenzie Alexander, who's off to the NFL.
All right, and with that, thank you for the Facebook questions. Thank you to Bud Elliott. He is going to be back here at 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 Pacific with our own Ryan Nanny. I'm off to San Francisco to cover the Super Bowl. I'd rather be here talking about signing day because it has been a crazy day. During the 5 p.m. Eastern show, we are going to be talking, as a company, I suppose, SB Nation, Pac-12 and Big 12 storylines and national storylines as a whole. We'll keep taking your Facebook questions. I hope that between now and then, another blue chip does not decommit from Oregon. That would be heartbreaking.
One update
I'm
here.
so sad. Yeah, what do you have?
I feel bad for Minnesota. I said that Dredrick
Oh,
Snelson.
no!
Yeah, he went to UCF.
Wow, for Scott Frost, an Oregon connection.
Talk about a guy who can get Snelson the ball in space.
Yes.
In that offense. So sorry, Minnesota.
Ooh.
That's disappointing. And then I did want to mention,
yes,
Michigan only took 3 players from the state of Michigan.
Yeah.
And one of them is a kicker. So if you're the Spartans, this is going to help your relationship with high school coaches in that state.
True.
Because I'm going to negatively recruit Jim Harbaugh, and I'm going to say, hey, he doesn't think the players in this state are good enough.
That's true. No players from Illinois, I saw.
We're going to recruit this state hard like we always have, and we're going to keep plucking good players out of this state.
And it should also be noted with regard to Michigan, Jim Harbaugh did not seal the deal with Connor Murphy, the sleepover friend that he had in Arizona. So
the younger brother of Trent.
The younger brother of Trent
and
Murphy.
And a great haircut on this kid. If you Google it, if you don't
It's
see
a puffy red mullet. You love every single second of it.
Yep.
Thank you very much for watching. Thank you to Bud Elliott. Come back at 5 p.m. Eastern for the Pac-12 and the Big 12. So much knowledge happening. We'll see you soon. Have a good signing day.